February 19th, 1945. The waters off the southeastern coast of Iwo Jima churned violently as hundreds of landing craft approached the volcanic shores. Among them, a 36-year-old Navy harbor pilot named Merrick Harland stood at the helm of a small patrol craft, his weathered face glistening with sea spray and sweat. His eyes narrowed as he studied the treacherous volcanic shoreline ahead, a shoreline where 14 patrol boats would soon be trapped by Iwo Jima's unpredictable tides and deadly volcanic sand. "Hold steady," Harland shouted over the diesel engine's roar, clutching a strange contraption fashioned from a broken signal mirror and a compass housing. The makeshift device, later dubbed the tide mirror, reflected the subtle changes in wave patterns invisible to the naked eye. Pointing it toward the beach, Harland detected something the other pilots couldn't see, a dangerous undertow forming along their designated landing zone. "6 degrees starboard," he ordered, gesturing urgently to the other boats in his formation. "The landing site's compromised." His executive officer hesitated, glancing nervously at the official landing coordinates. "Sir, those aren't our orders." Harland's jaw tightened. "Those orders will get us all killed. The tide patterns shifted since yesterday's reconnaissance. Trust me." As the formation reluctantly followed his lead, none of the men in the 7th Amphibious Support Squadron realized they were witnessing an act of both disobedience and improvisation that would alter the course of countless lives that morning. It would also challenge the very foundations of naval landing doctrine that had guided amphibious operations since Guadalcanal. No one in the United States Navy's Pacific Fleet knew that one man's defiance that morning would rewrite the tactical approach to volcanic island landings for the remainder of the Pacific campaign. Merrick Harland was born to a shipbuilding family in Gloucester, Massachusetts, in 1909. His father, a second-generation Scottish immigrant, worked as a commercial fishing vessel designer, instilling in young Merrick a deep respect for the sea's unpredictable nature. The Harland family lived modestly in a small clapboard house overlooking Gloucester Harbour, where Merrick spent his childhood studying the movements of fishing trawlers navigating the harbour's tricky currents. Even as a boy, Merrick understood water in ways that mystified grown men. His sister would later recall in a 1954 interview. "He could tell you when a storm was coming, just by watching how the small boats sat in the water at their moorings." At age 14, Merrick began working summers as a harbour assistant, guiding recreational vessels through Gloucester's notoriously challenging channels. Even then, the boy displayed an uncanny ability to read water patterns and predict tide shifts that seasoned captains often missed. By 17, local fishermen were specifically requesting the Harland boy to guide their vessels during difficult weather. Harland's formal education ended after high school, though not for lack of academic promise. The Great Depression had hit the northeast fishing industry particularly hard, forcing Merrick to work full-time to help support his family. He found steady employment with the Gloucester Harbour Commission, where his reputation for navigational intuition continued to grow. When larger vessels visited the harbour, Merrick was often called upon to assist the official harbour pilots, allowing him to develop expertise in handling everything from fishing trawlers to small cargo ships. In 1934, Merrick married his high school sweetheart, Elizabeth Donnell, a schoolteacher whose patience and quiet intelligence balanced his intense, sometimes obsessive focus on maritime matters. They had 2 children, a son, James, born in 1936, and a daughter, Margaret, in 1938. Though dedicated to his family, Harland's true passion remained the sea and its many mysteries. "Some men read books," Elizabeth would later write in her memoirs. "My husband read waves and wind and weather. He would stand for hours watching how water moved around obstacles. It wasn't just work to him, it was a calling." This calling found new purpose in December 1941. Following the attack on Pearl Harbor, Merrick, then 32, enlisted in the U.S. Navy. Despite being older than most recruits and having a wife and young children at home, he felt compelled to serve. His extensive experience with harbor navigation and vessel handling made him an ideal candidate for specialized training, and he was quickly assigned to naval harbor pilot duties. During his training at Naval Station Norfolk, Harland's instructors noted his exceptional ability to visualize underwater topography based solely on surface water patterns. One evaluation from this period described him as possessing an almost preternatural sense of how water behaves in varying conditions, a skill that cannot be taught but will prove invaluable in amphibious operations. After completing accelerated training, Harland was commissioned as an ensign and assigned to the Pacific Fleet, where amphibious landings were becoming increasingly crucial to the island-hopping strategy. His first combat experience came during the Gilbert Islands campaign, where he guided landing craft through the treacherous coral reefs of Tarawa in November 1943. The losses there were staggering, a bitter lesson in the consequences of inadequate beach reconnaissance and tide miscalculation. The Tarawa experience profoundly affected Harland. During the weeks following the battle, he began developing methods to better predict tide patterns and subsurface conditions from visual cues. Using scraps of equipment and his own intricate understanding of hydrodynamics, he experimented with reflective surfaces that might amplify subtle water movements invisible to the untrained eye. After Tarawa, something changed in him, recalled Lieutenant Philip Kerrigan, who served alongside Harland. He became obsessed with finding better ways to read landing beaches. He'd stay up all night sketching designs for these strange optical devices. Most of us thought he was just processing the trauma, but he was actually onto something revolutionary. By early 1944, Harland had been promoted to lieutenant junior grade and transferred to the 7th Amphibious Support Squadron, where his skills were put to use in the Marshalls and Marianas campaigns. Throughout these operations, he continued refining his techniques and improvised tools, occasionally employing them during difficult landings, though always within the bounds of his orders. What separated Harland from many of his peers was not just his navigational instinct but his understanding of physics. He had independently studied the principles of optics and hydrodynamics, grasping intuitively what scientists had codified through mathematical formulas. This self-education allowed him to comprehend how light refraction could reveal subsurface features when properly observed and interpreted. He wasn't just a skilled pilot, Elizabeth Harland would explain years later. He understood the science behind what he was seeing. That made all the difference when conventional wisdom failed. By the time planning began for Operation Detachment, the assault on Iwo Jima, Harland had earned both respect and a certain reputation for unorthodoxy. His commanding officers valued his expertise, but remained wary of his tendency to question standard procedures. This tension would prove crucial in the events that unfolded on that fateful February morning in 1945. The night before the landings, as his squadron prepared for their morning approach, Harland sensed that something wasn't right. The reconnaissance reports described beaches of firm volcanic sand, suitable for vehicle movement. But Harland, having observed volcanic shorelines in previous campaigns, suspected otherwise. That night, unable to sleep, he assembled the final version of his reflective device, the tide mirror that would soon save 14 patrol boats and potentially hundreds of lives. He had no idea that his instincts would be put to the ultimate test just hours later. The Solomon Islands campaign of 1943 had marked a turning point in the Pacific War. After the brutal fighting on Guadalcanal, American military planners recognized that amphibious warfare would define the path to Tokyo. Each island landing provided lessons paid for in blood, lessons about coral reefs, tidal patterns, and the deadly efficiency of Japanese defensive positions. By late 1944, the strategic focus shifted to targets closer to the Japanese homeland. Iwo Jima, a small volcanic island just 750 miles south of Tokyo, became a primary objective. Its value lay in its airfields, which Japanese forces used to stage attacks on American B-29 bombers. Capturing these airfields would not only eliminate this threat, but also provide emergency landing strips for damaged American aircraft returning from bombing missions over Japan. Operation Detachment, the code name for the Iwo Jima invasion, involved over 800 ships and more than 110,000 personnel. The largest amphibious assault of the Pacific War to that point, it required extensive planning and coordination between the Navy and Marine Corps. The initial landings were scheduled for February 19, 1945, with the invasion force departing from bases in the Marianas and Hawaiian Islands. The challenges of Iwo Jima differed significantly from previous island assaults. Unlike the coral atolls of the Central Pacific, Iwo Jima was a volcanic outcropping with unique shoreline characteristics. Intelligence reports described the landing beaches as steep but manageable, with volcanic sand that would provide stable footing for men and vehicles. These assessments would prove catastrophically inaccurate. 3 days before the landings on February 16th, battleships and cruisers began pounding Iwo Jima with the heaviest pre-invasion bombardment of the war. Aircraft from carrier task groups dropped tons of bombs on suspected Japanese positions. Despite this overwhelming firepower, most of the Japanese defenses remained intact. General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, the Japanese commander, had spent months preparing an elaborate network of underground bunkers, tunnels, and artillery positions, many impervious to naval gunfire and air attacks. The Marine Combat Divisions designated for the initial assault, the 4th and 5th, prepared for what intelligence officers predicted would be a difficult but manageable operation, lasting perhaps 10 days. In reality, they were about to engage in one of the bloodiest battles in Marine Corps history, a 36-day struggle that would claim nearly 7,000 American lives and wound another 20,000. For Merrick Harland and the sailors of the 7th Amphibious Support Squadron, the focus was narrower but no less crucial, safely delivering Marines and equipment to the designated beaches, despite whatever obstacles nature and the enemy might present. The squadron's 14 patrol boats were tasked with guiding the initial waves of landing craft, marking safe channels, and providing close support during the critical early phase of the assault. What made Iwo Jima particularly treacherous from a naval perspective was the combination of steep underwater gradients, unpredictable currents, and volcanic sand that behaved unlike anything encountered in previous landings. Standard tide tables and hydrographic charts, while technically accurate, failed to capture the unique interaction between these elements, precisely the sort of subtle dynamics that Harland had spent years learning to identify. The pre-invasion briefings emphasized following designated landing lanes and adhering strictly to timetables. Any deviation, officers were warned, would disrupt the carefully choreographed sequence of landings and potentially compromise the entire operation. It was within this rigid framework that Harland would soon be forced to make a fateful decision between following orders and trusting his instincts. As dawn broke on February 19th, the massive invasion force positioned itself off Iwo Jima's southeastern coast. At 0700 hours, naval gunfire intensified as battleships and cruisers delivered final preparatory bombardment. An hour later, aircraft from escort carriers began strafing the landing beaches. At 0830, the first wave of landing craft was launched from transport ships, stationed approximately 4,000 yards offshore. The 7th Amphibious Support Squadron's patrol boats, including Harland's, moved into position to guide this initial wave. Weather conditions seemed favorable: moderate seas, good visibility, light winds. Nothing in the official reports suggested anything but a standard approach to the designated landing zones. Yet as Harland studied the shoreline through his binoculars, he noticed disturbing patterns in the water movement. Something about the way waves were breaking against the black sand beaches indicated underwater features not shown on charts. Using his improvised tide mirror device, which amplified these subtle patterns through carefully calibrated reflection, he confirmed his suspicions. The combination of underwater volcanic formations and unusually strong tidal currents was creating dangerous conditions exactly where the first wave was headed. Within minutes, Harland would make the decision that would save his squadron and challenge everything the Navy thought it knew about amphibious landings on volcanic islands. The morning of February 19th, 1945 dawned clear over the sulphurous waters surrounding Iwo Jima. The massive American fleet, more than 450 ships, had moved into position during the night, transforming the empty sea into a floating city of steel and purpose. Aboard PCF 813, Lieutenant Merrick Harland had barely slept. Instead, he'd spent most of the night studying reconnaissance photographs and making final adjustments to his improvised tide mirror device. "You're overthinking this, Merrick," Lieutenant Commander Raymond Donahue, the squadron leader, had told him the previous evening. The hydrographic surveys are comprehensive. The landing beaches have been mapped down to the meter. Maps don't show how water moves. Sir, Harland had replied, and volcanic islands have patterns unlike anything in our doctrine. As the first hint of dawn broke across the eastern horizon, Harland stood on the bridge of his patrol craft, watching as landing ships began lowering the Higgins boats and Amtraks that would carry the first Marines ashore. Around him, 13 other patrol boats from the 7th Amphibious Support Squadron prepared to take up their positions as guides for the initial assault waves. The air vibrated with the thunder of naval gunfire as the massive battle wagons, including the USS Tennessee and USS Nevada, continued the pre-landing bombardment that had begun days earlier. Shells screamed overhead, impacting the dormant volcano of Mount Suribachi and the flat plains where Japanese airfields had been constructed. At 0700 hours, Harland received the order to advance toward the designated beaches, codenamed green, red, yellow, and blue, to establish the approach lanes for the landing craft. His boat was assigned to the Yellow Beach sector, where elements of the 4th Marine Division would come ashore. "Standard formation, standard approach," came the order from the command ship. "Maintain designated lanes at all costs." "Acknowledged," Harland replied, though a sense of unease had been growing in him since first light. Something about the water's behavior around the southeastern shoreline didn't match the pattern predicted by tide tables. The volcanic ash beaches were steeper than indicated in briefings, causing waves to break differently than expected. At 0730, with the patrol boats now about 1,000 yards from shore, Harland made his first crucial observation. Using his tide mirror, essentially a modified signal mirror mounted in a frame with reference markers, he detected a dangerous rip current forming precisely where the landing craft would be most vulnerable. "Command, this is PCF 813, he radioed. "Requesting permission to adjust Yellow Beach approach pattern. I'm detecting hazardous current conditions along the primary lane." There was a moment of static before the response came. "Negative PCF 813. Maintain designated approach. Surveys show no significant hazards in your sector." Harland exchanged glances with his executive officer, Ensign Victor Ramsey. "They're wrong," he said quietly, "and they're about to send those boys into a meat grinder." The executive officer shifted uncomfortably. "We have our orders, Lieutenant." "Orders based on faulty intelligence," Harland replied, studying the beach again through his binoculars. He could see now what the command ship couldn't, the distinctive water pattern that revealed a steep underwater drop-off, followed by a treacherous shelf of volcanic rock. Landing craft hitting this formation at the wrong angle would be capsized or broken apart by the powerful surf. As 0800 approached, with landing craft now beginning to form up behind the patrol boats, Harland made the decision that would define his naval career. He reached for the radio again. "Squadron, this is PCF 813. He broadcast on the squadron frequency rather than the command channel. "Yellow Beach approach is compromised by subsurface formations and rip currents. I'm adjusting course 6 degrees starboard to safer landing zone. Request squadron maintain formation on my lead." His 12 fellow patrol boat commanders faced the same dilemma Harland had moments earlier: follow standard protocol or trust their squadron mate's judgment. Lieutenant Roland Fraser of PCF 809 was the first to respond. "PCF 813, this is 809. Confirm your assessment. Over." Harland held up his tide mirror, using it to demonstrate the pattern he'd detected. The morning sun reflected off its surface in a way that highlighted the subtle differences in wave formation. Differences invisible to the naked eye, but crystal clear through Harland's improvised device. "Confirmed. The pattern is unmistakable." One by one, the other patrol boats acknowledged and adjusted their courses. Only PCF 821, commanded by the by-the-book Lieutenant Walter Prescott, refused. "This is 821. I'm maintaining original course as ordered. You're all risking court-martial." Harland watched as Prescott's boat continued toward the originally designated landing zone, while the rest of the squadron followed his adjusted course. The decision had been made. 13 patrol boats were now officially in violation of direct orders. As the formation approached the new landing area about 400 yards north of the original zone, Harland used his tide mirror again, confirming that this section of beach, while still challenging, lacked the deadly subsurface formations he'd detected earlier. The surf was more predictable here, the underwater approach more gradual. At 0830, the first wave of landing craft passed between the patrol boats, heading for shore under Harland's revised guidance. From his position just offshore, he watched anxiously as the initial Amtraks ground onto the volcanic sand beach. The Marines disembarked, struggling with the loose surface but making it ashore intact. Then came the moment of validation and horror. To the south, where Lieutenant Prescott had maintained the original landing zone, the first wave of craft following his lead hit the water exactly as Harland had feared. Powerful cross-currents caught the boats broadside, flipping to immediately. Others crashed against hidden volcanic formations, their hulls splintering under the impact. Marines were thrown into the churning surf, weighted down by equipment. "My God," Ensign Ramsey whispered beside Harland. "You were right." Harland didn't hesitate. 813 to all boats. Emergency rescue operations at original landing zone. Move now. For the next 45 minutes, as the main landing operation continued along Harland's revised approach, the patrol boats conducted a frantic rescue mission at the original site. They pulled dozens of Marines from the water and assisted stranded landing craft in navigating away from the hazardous area. Lieutenant Prescott's boat had itself become trapped in the very danger zone he'd insisted on marking, its propellers fouled by debris from shattered landing craft. By 0930, the situation had stabilized. All 13 patrol boats that had followed Harland's lead had successfully guided their landing craft to shore. The Marines were advancing inland, establishing the beachhead that would eventually lead to the capture of Iwo Jima after more than a month of bitter fighting. As Harland's boat returned to the command ship to refuel, he knew that his decision, while vindicated by events, would still have consequences. He had directly disobeyed an order during combat operations. Even saving lives might not be enough to shield him from military justice. What he couldn't know then was that his improvised tide mirror and the decision it informed would soon change naval amphibious doctrine for the remainder of the Pacific War, though the price of that change would first include facing those who believed that orders, however flawed, must never be questioned. In the heat of battle, Lieutenant Merrick Harland had no time to consider the broader implications of his actions. His focus remained solely on guiding as many landing craft as possible to safety through the treacherous waters off Iwo Jima's coast. As the morning of February 19th wore on, the magnitude of his split-second decision became increasingly apparent. Offshore, chaos had erupted at the original landing zone. Lieutenant Prescott's patrol boat, PCF 821, was taking on water after being smashed against a volcanic outcropping. 2 landing craft had capsized entirely, spilling Marines and equipment into the churning surf. Others were stuck on the underwater shelf Harland had detected, their crews desperately trying to free them before Japanese artillery zeroed in on their vulnerable positions. 813 to squadron. Form rescue teams of 2 boats each, Harland ordered, taking command of the situation despite lacking official authority to do so. Pair up and approach from alternate angles. Use your boat hooks and lines to snag survivors. The sea around the original landing zone had become a maelstrom of debris, struggling swimmers, and damaged craft. Adding to the danger, Japanese artillery had begun finding its range, sending geysers of water erupting dangerously close to the stranded vessels. Unlike the more northerly beach where Harland had redirected the main landing force, this section offered no natural cover from the enemy positions on Mount Suribachi. Lieutenant Fraser's boat, PCF 809, maneuvered alongside a half-submerged landing craft where 6 Marines clung to the gunwales. "Easy approaches only," Harland cautioned over the radio. The current still strengthening with the tide change. For nearly 2 hours, the patrol boats worked tirelessly to rescue stranded personnel and salvage what equipment they could. Harland's tide mirror proved invaluable during these operations, allowing him to predict momentary calms in the chaotic water patterns, brief windows when rescue attempts were least likely to endanger more lives. He'd call out these moments when the water would suddenly slack. Radio man Joseph Witkowski later recalled, 3, 2, 1 now, he'd shout. And sure enough, there'd be this perfect moment to pull someone aboard before the current kicked back up. It was like he had some sixth sense about it. By 1100 hours, The rescue operation had transitioned to recovery. 76 Marines and 17 Navy personnel had been pulled from the water alive. 23 others had been lost, a tragic number, but far fewer than might have perished had the entire landing force followed the original approach path. Lieutenant Prescott and the crew of PCF 821 had themselves been rescued, their patrol boat abandoned after sustaining irreparable damage. Soaked and shivering on the deck of Harlan's vessel, Prescott avoided his fellow officer's eyes. "You were right," he finally said, his voice barely audible above the engines. "I should have listened." Harlan merely nodded, too focused on coordinating the remaining rescue efforts to dwell on vindication. What mattered now was ensuring no more lives were lost unnecessarily. As noon approached, a new radio message crackled through. "PCF 813, this is command. Lieutenant Harlan, report to USS El Dorado immediately. Repeat, report immediately." The USS El Dorado was the amphibious force flagship, where Rear Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, commander of all amphibious forces in the Pacific, had established his headquarters for the Iwo Jima operation. The summons could mean only one thing. Harlan would have to answer for his insubordination. "Ensign Ramsey, you have the con," Harlan said, surrendering command to his executive officer. "Continue recovery operations until 1300, then rejoin the landing support pattern." "Aye, sir," Ramsey replied, then added quietly, "Good luck with the brass." 30 minutes later, Harlan's boat pulled alongside the massive command ship. As he climbed the accommodation ladder, his uniform still damp with seawater and grime, he mentally prepared his defense. He had disobeyed direct orders, yes, but those orders had been based on fatally flawed intelligence about beach conditions. His actions had saved lives, not just the Marines who would have landed in the danger zone, but the crews of 13 patrol boats that might otherwise have been lost. On the El Dorado's bridge, Rear Admiral Turner was waiting alongside Major General Harry Schmidt, commander of the 5th Amphibious Corps, and Captain Edmund Morrison, who had developed the original landing plan. Their expressions revealed nothing as Harlan saluted and reported as ordered. "Lieutenant Harlan," Admiral Turner began, his voice deceptively mild, "you redirected an entire squadron of patrol boats without authorization, contravening the established landing plan and creating potential chaos in a carefully orchestrated operation. What exactly possessed you to take such action?" Harlan stood at attention, his gaze fixed on a point just above the Admiral's head. "Sir, I detected dangerous subsurface conditions not indicated in our hydrographic surveys. The original landing zone contained a volcanic shelf and unpredicted current patterns that would have—" "And how exactly did you detect these conditions when our survey teams found nothing?" Captain Morrison interrupted, skepticism evident in his tone. Harlan reached slowly into his pocket and withdrew his tide mirror device. "With this, sir." The three senior officers exchanged glances as Harlan explained the principles behind his improvised tool, how the calibrated reflective surface captured subtle water patterns invisible to standard observation, revealing subsurface hazards through their effect on wave formation. "It's based on principles I've been studying since Tarawa, sir," Harlan explained. "Water behaves differently over volcanic formations than over coral or sand. The reflection patterns are distinctive if you know what to look for." Admiral Turner took the device, examining it with undisguised curiosity. "And this contraption told you our landing plan was flawed?" "Not the plan itself, sir. Just the specific approach to Yellow Beach. The northern section where I redirected the landing force had a more gradual underwater gradient and more predictable current patterns." General Schmidt, who had remained silent until now, finally spoke. "The initial casualty reports from the beach seem to support your assessment, Lieutenant. The landings at your revised location proceeded with minimal craft losses. The original zone has indeed proven problematic." A tense silence followed, during which Harlan maintained his rigid posture, awaiting judgment. Finally, Admiral Turner returned the tide mirror and stepped to the bridge window, gazing out at the distant shoreline where Marines continued to stream ashore. "Lieutenant," he said at last, "under normal circumstances, I would have you court-martialed for such flagrant disregard of the chain of command." Harlan swallowed hard, but remained silent. "However," the Admiral continued, These are not normal circumstances. Your actions, while insubordinate, undoubtedly saved lives and equipment we cannot afford to lose. He turned to face Harland directly. I want a full report on this device of yours and the principles behind it. Captain Morrison will work with you to develop protocols for incorporating your observations into future landing operations. The implied reprieve was clear, but Turner wasn't finished. Understand this, Lieutenant. You're not being commended for disobeying orders. You're being tasked with ensuring that future orders account for the conditions you've identified. Is that clear? Perfectly clear, Admiral. Thank you, sir. Dismissed. As Harland departed the El Dorado to rejoin his squadron, he felt a complex mixture of relief, vindication, and lingering anxiety. He had avoided court-martial, but the real test would come in the days ahead as he attempted to formalize his intuitive understanding of water patterns into something that could be taught to other officers. What he couldn't know then was that his tide mirror would soon be replicated and distributed throughout the Pacific Fleet, becoming standard equipment for harbor pilots and landing craft commanders. Nor could he anticipate that the 14 patrol boats he had redirected, the Iwo Jima 14 as they would later be called, would go on to participate in every major amphibious operation for the remainder of the war, their crews crediting Harland's improvised device with their survival. The battle for Iwo Jima was just beginning. For the Marines fighting their way inland against fanatical Japanese resistance, the hardest days lay ahead. But on the beaches, a quiet revolution in amphibious warfare had already taken place, one that would save countless lives in the invasions yet to come. Dawn on February 20th found Lieutenant Merrick Harland back on the bridge of PCF 813, surveying Iwo Jima's chaotic beaches through exhausted eyes. He had spent most of the night in the cramped wardroom of the USS El Dorado, working alongside Captain Morrison and hydrographic specialists to document the principles behind his tide mirror innovation. Sleep had been an afterthought, managed in 20-minute increments between urgent consultations. The beaches themselves had been transformed overnight. What had been pristine black volcanic sand was now a churning industrial zone of men, machines, and organized chaos. Dozens of landing craft continued to shuttle back and forth between the transport ships and shore, delivering the tons of supplies needed to sustain the marine advance. Bulldozers and tractors struggled through the soft volcanic ash, attempting to create pathways for the heavier equipment still waiting offshore. Most striking to Harland was the visible difference between the original landing zone and his revised location. To the south, where Lieutenant Prescott had maintained position, the beach remained littered with the broken hulls of landing craft and amphibious tractors, victims of the treacherous underwater formations. To the north, at Harland's redirect point, the landing operations continued with relative efficiency despite the challenging surf conditions. 813, this is command, his radio crackled. Lieutenant Harland, prepare to receive technical team from Beach Battalion 3. Admiral's orders. Within the hour, a landing craft pulled alongside Harland's patrol boat, delivering a 4-man team led by Lieutenant Commander Howard Vickery, a naval engineer specializing in amphibious operations. Vickery carried with him several crude prototypes based on Harland's original tide mirror design, created overnight by the machine shop aboard the El Dorado. Lieutenant Harland, Vickery greeted him, I'm told you've developed some kind of water witch device that can see through waves. Despite his fatigue, Harland managed a tight smile. Nothing quite so mysterious, Commander. It simply amplifies visual patterns already present in the water. For the next 3 hours, as their boats patrolled the approaches to Yellow Beach, Harland demonstrated the principles behind his innovation. Using both his original device and Vickery's prototypes, he showed how subtle differences in wave formation could reveal underwater hazards invisible to conventional observation. It's all about the reflection angle and having consistent reference points, Harland explained. Volcanic islands create unique water patterns because of their steep underwater gradients and the way volcanic rock affects current flow. The tide mirror just makes these patterns more obvious to the human eye. Vickery's initial skepticism gradually gave way to professional curiosity. By midday, he was using one of the prototypes himself, successfully identifying a previously unmapped underwater obstruction that could have endangered the afternoon landing schedule. I'll be damned, the commander muttered. It actually works. It works because it's based on principles that have always been there, Harland replied. Harbour pilots have been reading water this way for centuries, just not with this kind of precision or in combat conditions. As they continued their patrol, Harland explained how his years in Gloucester Harbour had taught him to recognize how different underwater features affected surface water behavior. The tide mirror merely quantified what experienced mariners had always known intuitively. The problem with amphibious operations is we're asking landing craft coxswains to make complex hydrodynamic judgments with minimal training and under enemy fire, he observed. This device gives them a tool to see what experienced pilots see naturally. By late afternoon, word of Harland's innovation had spread throughout the invasion force. The patrol boats of the 7th Amphibious Support Squadron were now being called the mirror boats by landing craft crews, who increasingly requested their guidance when approaching unfamiliar sections of the beach. Admiral Turner, recognizing the potential value of the technique, ordered an immediate reassessment of landing plans for the western beaches, where the 6th Marine Regiment would come ashore the following day. Harland and his squadron were temporarily detached from regular patrol duties to conduct a comprehensive survey using the tide mirror method. What they discovered was sobering. The western approach contained even more dangerous subsurface formations than the southern beaches, with powerful cross-currents that could easily capsize fully loaded landing craft. Using Harland's technique, they mapped a safer approach channel that zigzagged to avoid the worst hazards, a route that looked inefficient on paper but would prove far safer in practice. This isn't just about Iwo Jima, Commander Vickery remarked as they completed the survey. If this works here, it could revolutionize our approach to every volcanic island in the Pacific. Okinawa, Japan itself, they all have similar underwater characteristics. Harland nodded, though his thoughts were more immediate. Right now, I'm just concerned about getting tomorrow's landing force ashore alive. As darkness fell on February 20th, Harland received new orders directly from Admiral Turner's staff. Effective immediately, he was assigned to Beach Battalion 3 as a special technical advisor with authority to modify landing approaches based on his tide mirror assessments. His patrol boat crew would continue operations under Ensign Ramsey's command, while Harland himself would coordinate beach reconnaissance for all subsequent landings. It was an unprecedented level of authority for a junior officer, reflecting both the value of his innovation and the urgent need to reduce landing craft casualties. What had begun as a moment of insubordination had evolved in just 36 hours into official doctrine. That night, as Harland tried to snatch a few hours of sleep aboard the command ship, he found himself reflecting on the strange path that had led him to this point. His entire naval career had been building toward this moment, not through ambition or strategic planning, but through a lifetime of observing how water behaved around obstacles. Some men are born to lead armies, his father had once told him. You were born to read water. That's no small thing in a world that's mostly ocean. As Harland drifted into exhausted sleep, he couldn't know that his improvised device would soon be standardized and manufactured in the hundreds, becoming standard equipment for every amphibious landing from Iwo Jima to Okinawa and beyond. Nor could he anticipate that after the war, his Harland method of hydrographic assessment would be incorporated into naval training manuals, saving lives well into the Korean conflict. For now, it was enough that 14 patrol boats, his Iwo Jima 14, had survived when they might easily have been lost. And tomorrow, hundreds more Marines would reach shore safely because one harbor pilot had trusted what his tide mirror revealed. The next 4 weeks on Iwo Jima would witness some of the most brutal fighting of the Pacific War. The Japanese, entrenched in elaborate tunnel systems and natural caves, contested every foot of ground with fanatical determination. Marine casualties mounted daily as they fought to secure the airfields and eventually the entire island. Mount Suribachi fell on February 23rd, producing the iconic flag-raising photograph that would become a symbol of American resolve. But the northern part of the island would not be declared secure until March 16th, after 26 days of continuous combat. Throughout this period, the work initiated by Harland's tide mirror innovation continued to evolve. What had begun as a single officer's improvised solution expanded into a systematic approach to beach reconnaissance and landing craft guidance. By early March, every patrol boat in the invasion force had been equipped with a standardized version of the tide mirror, and crews were being trained in its use by instructors from Beach Battalion 3. Harland himself divided his time between direct observation of beach conditions and training sessions with landing craft coxswains. His method, once viewed with skepticism by traditional naval officers, had been validated by results. Landing craft losses due to natural hazards dropped by 63% in sectors where tide mirror techniques were employed. On March 3rd, 13 days into the battle, Harland received word that Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, would be visiting Iwo Jima to assess the progress of operations. Among the Admiral's specific interests was the new beach reconnaissance technique that had reportedly saved dozens of landing craft and hundreds of lives. The meeting took place aboard the USS Indianapolis, Nimitz's flagship for the visit. Harland, now promoted to lieutenant senior grade for his contributions, reported as ordered, carrying with him the original tide mirror and a comprehensive report on its applications. Admiral Nimitz, known for his direct manner and technical curiosity, wasted little time on formalities. "Show me how this device works, Lieutenant," he said after brief introductions. For the next hour, Harland demonstrated the principles behind the tide mirror, explaining how it translated subtle water patterns into readable indicators of subsurface conditions. Nimitz, who had begun his naval career in submarines and understood hydrodynamics better than most flag officers, grasped the concept immediately. "What you've done," the Admiral observed, "is quantify what experienced seamen have always done intuitively. You've made an art into a science." "That's exactly it, sir," Harland agreed. "The patterns have always been there. The tide mirror just makes them visible to those without years of experience." Nimitz considered this, then asked the question that had been circulating among senior officers since the device's introduction. "Why wasn't this developed sooner? We've conducted dozens of amphibious operations before Iwo Jima." Harland chose his words carefully. "Sir, I believe it's because most of our previous landings were on coral atolls or established harbors. Volcanic islands create unique water patterns that don't match our standard hydrographic models. It took the particular conditions here to make the need obvious." The Admiral nodded thoughtfully. "And it took someone with your particular background to recognize it. Not every naval officer spent their youth in Gloucester Harbour." The reference to Harland's pre-war experience surprised him. Clearly, Nimitz had reviewed his service record carefully. "Yes, sir, I was fortunate to have that training, informal though it was." "Not fortunate, Lieutenant. Prepared." Nimitz closed the file containing Harland's report. "I'm authorizing immediate production of 500 standardized tide mirror units for distribution throughout the Pacific Fleet. Additionally, I want you to develop a formal training program for beach reconnaissance teams. We have more islands to take before this war is over." "Aye, sir. Thank you, sir." As Harland prepared to depart, Nimitz added a final comment. "One more thing, Lieutenant. When this war is over, the Navy will need to codify the lessons we've learned about amphibious operations. Your contribution will be an important chapter in that story." By mid-March, as fighting on Iwo Jima entered its final phase, Harland's tide mirror had become standard equipment throughout the invasion force. The 14 patrol boats of the 7th Amphibious Support Squadron, the original mirror boats, had achieved near-legendary status among landing craft crews, who specifically requested their guidance when approaching difficult beach sections. On March 20th, with the island officially declared secure despite pockets of Japanese resistance, Harland received new orders. He was to return to Pearl Harbor immediately to establish a training program for the upcoming Okinawa invasion. His experience at Iwo Jima and the technique he had developed there were considered vital to reducing casualties in what would be the largest amphibious assault of the Pacific War. Before departing, Harland took one final patrol along the beaches, where his innovation had first proven its worth. The black volcanic sand that had once been pristine was now scarred by warfare and industrialization, covered with the apparatus of modern combat. Yet the water patterns offshore remained as they had been on that first morning, complex, potentially deadly, but now readable thanks to the tide mirror. As his boat turned back toward the transport waiting to return him to Hawaii, Harland reflected on how a single moment of creative insubordination had cascaded into institutional change. He had risked his career to save 14 patrol boats, never imagining that his improvised solution would eventually save hundreds more vessels and thousands of lives. The war would continue for nearly 5 more months, culminating in the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Harland's tide mirror technique would be employed throughout this period, most notably during the Okinawa campaign, where complex coastal waters presented many of the same challenges as Iwo Jima. By war's end, over 400 standardized tide mirrors had been deployed throughout the Pacific Fleet, and Harland's method had been incorporated into official Navy amphibious doctrine. After Japan's surrender in August 1945, Lieutenant Commander Merrick Harland, his second promotion having come in July, was assigned to the Naval Hydrographic Office in Washington, D.C., where he helped develop the next generation of beach reconnaissance techniques. His work there would influence amphibious operations well into the Cold War era, though the advent of helicopter landing capabilities and improved hydrographic survey methods eventually rendered the original tide mirror obsolete. Harland remained in the Navy until 1953, retiring as a full commander to return to Gloucester with Elizabeth and their children. There he established a maritime consulting firm specializing in harbor navigation and coastal engineering, applying the principles he had refined during wartime to peaceful commercial applications. His firm would go on to design navigation systems for major ports throughout the eastern seaboard. In 1957, the Navy posthumously honored Lieutenant Walter Prescott, who had died in subsequent operations off Okinawa, by naming a hydrographic survey vessel after him. In a gesture that symbolized how completely Harland's once controversial innovation had been embraced by the Navy establishment, they invited Commander Harland, retired, to deliver the commissioning address. Lieutenant Prescott and I disagreed on that fateful morning off Iwo Jima, Harland told the assembled crowd, but we both served the same purpose, to bring our men home safely. The difference was not in our dedication, but in our tools. He followed the charts as they existed. I had the means to see what the charts couldn't show. The Iwo Jima 14, the original patrol boat saved by Harland's innovation, had diverse post-war fates. 7 were decommissioned and scrapped after 1946. 3 were transferred to the Coast Guard for coastal patrol duties. 4 remained in naval service through the Korean War, participating in amphibious operations including the Incheon landing, where tide mirror techniques were again employed to reduce landing craft casualties. As for the original tide mirror itself, Harland's handmade device fashioned from a broken signal mirror and compass housing, it found a permanent home at the U.S. Naval Academy in Annapolis, displayed alongside other innovations that had shaped modern naval warfare. The accompanying plaque reads simply, "Tide Mirror, developed by LCDR Merrick Harland, February 1945, saved 14 patrol boats at Iwo Jima and transformed amphibious landing techniques throughout the Pacific theater." In his later years, Harland rarely spoke about his wartime experiences, preferring to focus on his family and his continuing work in maritime navigation. When pressed by historians or journalists about his moment of inspirational disobedience, he would typically deflect with characteristic humility. "I didn't disobey orders," he would insist. "I just found a better way to accomplish their intent. The goal was never to follow a specific path to the beach. It was to get our men ashore alive. That's what we did." Merrick Harland passed away in 1978 at the age of 69, survived by his wife Elizabeth, their children James and Margaret, and 5 grandchildren. His obituary in the Gloucester Daily Times mentioned his naval service and his local reputation as a harbour navigation expert, but made only passing reference to the innovation that had saved so many lives at Iwo Jima. This modest tribute would have pleased him. He had never considered himself a hero, merely a man who had applied his particular skills when they were most needed. Today, advanced satellite imaging and computer modeling have replaced the need for tools like the tide mirror. Modern amphibious operations benefit from precision hydrographic data unimaginable in 1945. Yet the principle Harland established remains valid. Sometimes direct observation by experienced eyes reveals what even the most sophisticated technology might miss. In 2005, during exercises in the Western Pacific, a young Navy lieutenant noticed unusual water patterns near a designated landing beach that didn't match the computer models. Remembering a case study from Annapolis about an improvised device used at Iwo Jima, she ordered a course correction that avoided a previously unmapped underwater hazard. When asked later how she had spotted the danger, she credited the Harland principle, the idea that water itself will reveal its secrets to those trained to read its surface. This is perhaps Merrick Harland's most enduring legacy, not just the lives he saved on a February morning off Iwo Jima, but the mindset he fostered that values direct observation alongside advanced technology. His story reminds us that in warfare, as in life, sometimes the most effective innovations come not from complex systems, but from individuals with the courage to trust what they see with their own eyes. The battle for Iwo Jima has receded into history. Most who fought there have now passed away. The 14 patrol boats that Harland saved have long since disappeared, their metal returned to industry or surrendered to corrosion. Even the tide mirror technique has been superseded by technologies unimaginable in 1945. Yet whenever naval vessels approach unfamiliar shores, whenever landing craft carry troops through breaking surf, something of Merrick Harland's legacy continues. In that moment when theoretical models meet physical reality, when charts and computers must be reconciled with what can be observed directly, his influence remains. Would you have had the courage to disobey direct orders based solely on what a homemade device revealed to you about wave patterns? Would you have risked court-martial to redirect 14 vessels based on your personal assessment of water conditions? These are the questions that make Harland's story not just a tale of wartime innovation, but a study in moral courage and professional judgment. In an age increasingly dominated by algorithms and automated systems, perhaps the most valuable lesson from the tide mirror story is this: technology serves human judgment, not the other way around. Merrick Harland didn't reject naval charts or hydrographic surveys. He supplemented them with direct observation, creating a more complete picture that saved lives when it mattered most. Share this story of how one Harbour pilot's improvised device saved 14 patrol boats at Iwo Jima. Let others remember that sometimes the most important innovations aren't planned by committees or developed in laboratories, but created in moments of urgent necessity by individuals with the vision to see what others miss and the courage to act on what they see.